Okay,
This
so let's start.
conference will now be recorded.
I ask everybody to switch off their mic so we avoid like annoying feedbacks. So thank you very much, Giorgos, to be with us today. I mean, for me, it's an honor. And just say a few words about Giorgos' profile. Well, Giorgos is a very well-known scholar. He has a very, I would say, he has a very rich kind of educational background, no? That spans from chemistry to environmental engineering. He has a PhD in environmental studies, a master in economics, and he worked with two big names in ecological economics, just to mention some of his collaborators. One is Richard Norgaard in Berkeley in the US, and the other one is Joan Martínez Salier in the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And since 2008 is ICREA research and then professor in Barcelona. ICREA is this Institute of Advanced Studies that we have in Spain, founded by the governments of the regional government of Catalonia, and he's based in the ITA, where he contributed to found the group Research and Degrowth that is very much active in Spain but also in Europe, I would say. And it's also one of the organizer of the biannual International Conference of Degrowth. He published some of the most cited books in the field of degrowth, such as Degrowth, a vocabulary for a new era, and the last book is titled The Case for Degrowth. So he's very much active also in the journals of ecological economics. Most of our PhD students are familiar with his work, and more recently he has published some reflection that resonates with my work and Andrea Genovese work about eco-socialism. For example, the paper on CNN called Socialism and Without Growth. And I just read one of his posts with a recent PhD called Timothy Parrick. I don't know if the pronunciation is right, called Degrowth Socialism Without Growth, exploring the possibility of creating a socialist economy based on the principle of degrowth. I'm very happy to say that we share two passions, like playing the piano and reading Ursula K. Le Guin, and actually her work is actually mentioned in a number of times in his book Limits, which is also one of my favorite books of Giorgos. So Giorgos, the floor is yours. I think you are going to present some of the ideas that are behind this book, Limits.
How much time do I have?
We are flexible, Giorgos. Talk for how long as you like, really.
Okay. No, that's not a good idea.
We set the thing for 40 minutes, but
okay, I'll put half an hour, and we see. Okay, half an hour is good. Okay, so thank you, Mario. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for inviting me. I followed Andrea's advice, and let's say with pleasure of not preparing a structured presentation that I would read and that I would show you the slides, the PowerPoint, etc. I do this sometimes, but I think in some instances it works better to be a little bit more fluid and flexible and just share with you ideas and then having conversation. I'm gonna use a few images just to ground my ideas, but I'm not gonna use text and I'm not gonna follow an order. So I don't have a very clear order in my head. Other that I've written these two books recently, so I have them very fresh in my mind, and I'm in the pleasurable position of that they are so fresh in my head that I can talk out of my head about them. It's not something that I'm still struggling to clarify. So I think Andrea saw my presentation on Edinburgh, where sorry, it wasn't Edinburgh, it was in Norway. That I also didn't have in mind what to do, and I started talking about the book cover, and this way I presented the book on degrowth, and actually I felt also it was the best presentation I've done on the book, much better than when I follow, the plot. So I thought of doing something similar today, and I have a few images that will guide me around, but generally I want to share with you the stories of my two last books. The one is called Limits, Why Malthus Was Wrong and Why Environmentalists Should Care. And the second one is The Case for Degrowth. In terms of ideas, they're very connected, and I think I will articulate the connections here. In terms of format also, they're quite similar because they're both short books and intended for a wide audience. So they're like around 25,000 words, and they have forced me a little bit to communicate some ideas in the simplest form possible. So that's what I'll try to do here. The picture here of limits, and I'm gonna explain also what I mean limits without scarcity, which is the argument of the first book, of the book Limits. The picture here is the sky, and the sky is also the nice cover. Oops, yeah, I hear some Italian pilots talking in my my head. I don't know. It's a plane flying or something. No. So the book cover that shows at Stanford was the sky, and well, you see there is limits and there is the sky there, and I really had to struggle with what cover I wanted there. So Mario said I have the passion for piano. I use the metaphor of the piano in the book. So I was trying to insist to have the book cover of a piano in my books. Why a piano? Because one core metaphor I use in the book, one core distinction I make in the book is between limits as something that comes from the outside and something that we consider as an undesirable imposition that it's coming to us from the outside, and limits as something that we put upon ourselves, we want to put upon ourselves because it's a condition for our freedom. This might sound a little bit of a complex theoretical idea or a little bit counterintuitive now, that we have to limit ourselves rather than consider that limits are coming from the outside. And the way I best found in this book to communicate this idea was with the image of a movie. And the movie is called, it's actually, I see many of you are Italians, so it's a movie by an Italian director, and the play is Italian too. It's The Legend of 1900, no? And the movie was by Giuseppe Tornatore. The play right now, I don't remember. I've seen the movie, I haven't read the theater play. And there are two powerful images there. One is the whole story, which is a guy who is found as a baby on the bottom of an oceanic liner that crosses the Atlantic exactly in the year 1900. He's found there on New Year's Eve. They call him 1900. He spends his whole life on the boat. He becomes a very famous pianist, very notorious outside of the boat. Music producers come in the boat. They try to take him out to say, you're the best piano player. You should come out. You should become famous. And he decides not to leave the plane. So he says, the ship, the oceanic liner. And he says, no, my world is within here, and I need these limits, this limited world in order to create, in order to develop my freedom. And once he falls in love and he's almost ready to go out of the boat, and then he sees the full city of New York in front of him that has no limit. That's how he describes it later. And he says, I couldn't go out there because I couldn't see a limit. So this city didn't have a limit. And for me, this was debilitating. I couldn't imagine myself out there in a place without a limit. And he uses there the metaphor of the piano. And he says, the piano has a limited number of keys. But with this limited number of keys, I can make incredible music. I can play whatever music I like. If you gave me a piano with infinite keys, with unlimited keys, I would just look at it and I wouldn't do anything. I wouldn't know where to start. This metaphor for me captures the difference between limits as something being outside and something you put upon yourself. So he didn't exit the boat putting a limit upon himself because he needed this limit in order to function and create. And it's a starting metaphor that guides my book in order to make this distinction between limits and self-limitation. Now, the book cover, I wanted the piano, but from Stanford, they told me, if you put a book about Malthus, Environmentalists, and you put a piano, people will be completely confused of what it is about, so no one will pick it up. And
Ma come si cambia lingua?
I had a little bit of a back and forth with them, and I said, really trust us, like a book with a piano, no. So then I said, okay, you do whatever cover you want. And then they came with this cover, which is also nice because it's the sky. And they take this because there is the saying, the sky is the limit, no? There's the saying that the sky is the limit. But the sky is no longer the limit in one sense. And what I'm arguing is for putting limits to things that blinders and putting a limit to what seems unlimited, the sky. No, again, the sky. In order to see the sky, you need a window. No, you need a limit. Otherwise, the sky is something also you cannot perceive. No, the window, the vista of the window, is the one that gives shape to the sky. And I also like the image that it shows. Now, what I argue in the book is I'm addressing environmentalists. I don't know how many of you consider yourself environmentalists or have you been trained in the environmental field. But for many of us trained to think about the environment, we've been trained to talk a lot about limits and to think about limits. But we tend to think of limits as something that it's outside there, that nature is limited, planet Earth as being limited, you know. There is this you might hear very often when you hear histories of the environmental movement, at least the Western environmental movement and the environmental politics, that, you know, they started the moment we flew to space, no? And we saw the Earth from the outside and we realized that we all live in a limited planet that we have to share and that it's like a spaceship, no? And it's a limited spaceship and we cannot overuse it or extend. A popular framework right now within environmental sciences and planetary sciences is the framework of planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries, it's kind of illustrated in the same way. It's like a circle. It's the boundaries and it's things that we cannot exceed, like limits the planet puts to us, and that we cannot and we should not exceed. And of course, a very founding document for the environmental movement was Limits to Growth, a report written in 1972, out of coincidence, the very year I was born. I didn't know that at the time, which says, you know, there are limits to how much we can use in the planet, how much growth can go on without crashing, etc. Now, that's how we're trained as environmentalists to think, you know. But in my book, I make a little bit of a counterintuitive argument. And my argument is that this way of thinking about the environment as something limited that comes from the outside and put a limit on us is part and parcel of the very ideology of limitless growth. So the very idea because the dominant ideology of our time is that we need growth and that growth can go on forever and growth has to go on forever in order not to have problems, social problems, unemployment, etc. I'm arguing that these two ideas, that we face limits and that we have to expand without limits, actually are two sides of the same coin, and one feeds into the other. And interestingly, that's why I put this image here. I find it interesting that the moment that we supposedly realized that Earth is a limited planet was the very moment that we were escaping it. It was the moment that we were crossing outside of the boundary. And I'm arguing that this way of framing our relationship to nature as one of being limited is one that it's a very Western one. It's one that was in the frontier, which was part also of the colonizing process, which was like the English or the Spaniards thinking that they face limits within their countries and then expanding somewhere out there. And that it's like a very fundamental idea of capitalism, that it needs this specter of limits in order to justify its continuous pursuit of unlimited growth. And that's the main argument of this book. Now, why do I talk about Malthus? Why is Malthus in the title? Because Malthus's book, The Principle of Population, written in 1798, it's considered to be like the very first book that puts the question of limits. The way someone would come to it in studies or in reading even popular magazines like The Economist and others who refer every now and then to Malthus, is that Malthus was a prophet of doom, who, exactly as capitalism was taking off and industrialization was taking off, he was stuck and he started saying that there are limits to food, and that there's going to be famines, and that there is overpopulation, etc., etc. This is the dominant story, and this is something that almost no one questions and everyone reproduces without, I think, really reading Malthus, because it's considered like saying Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations and he talked about free markets, no? So everyone considers that this is like how it is, and you don't need to even read it, no? Actually, I haven't read Adam Smith, no? So I'm not playing the clever one here. I know many of us talk about things that we haven't read. On this particular one, I read it carefully because I wanted to say something differently, and I came to the lead that there might be something different hidden here. And what I argue is hidden here is precisely this logic of capitalism, that the priests of early capitalism, and Malthus wasn't metaphorically a priest of capitalism, he was really a priest of capitalism because he was a priest and then he became the first professor of economics. So he was literally a priest of capitalism. Malthus, the priest of capitalism, at that time that things were just happening, was trying to justify what was going on. So he was trying to justify why more and more wealth was produced. He wanted to justify why it shouldn't be redistributed to the poor. He was writing against revolutions and against the first revolution and against the idea of equality. So basically what he came up with, the model he came up with, was one that he said that, we do face limits in food because population can increase without limit and they always exceed the available food that we have. So he argued that the best thing we can do is keep the poor so that they work as hard as possible. And this way we produce as much food as possible to satisfy the greatest number of people possible. If we redistribute to the poor, they're going to get lazy. They're just going to have more children. They're not going to produce enough food, and then everyone is going to collapse. So equality is impossible. What Malthus did there, I argue, was like to mobilize the idea of limits to population, by assuming a drive for unlimited desire to have children and unlimited population growth, in order to justify early capitalism and the promise of capitalism to provide more and more and satisfy more and more of our unlimited wants. My argument is that this logic that appears in this essay is the logic of economics ever since, and it's also the logic of capitalist system until our day. So you will hear the same argument being done over and over. We won't redistribute because people will get lazy. We need to produce more. We don't have enough. We don't have enough for everyone right now. And that was how Malthus put it. There is not enough for everyone to have a decent share. And that's what you will still hear, like 300 years after, with the economy 20 times bigger, you will still hear that there is not enough to have a decent share for everyone, and we need to work a little bit more and produce a little bit more. So on the one hand, there isn't enough for everyone, so there is a limit, and on the other hand, we have to work more to overcome this limit. If you want to put it in environmental terms, we have climate change, which is a limit, but we have to do something more, geoengineer, or I don't know, fly ourselves out and colonize Mars, So there is a constant dialectic between this invocation of limits and the effort to overjump these limits. I argue that this is what capitalism does. Like, capitalism needs both these limits in order to have scarcity, and it also needs limitless growth, because capital needs to increase at a certain percentage in order to not be devalued. So for capitalism, this is fundamental logic, but this is the scheme through which it has been propagated, and it's unfortunately a scheme that even environmentalists like myself have fallen into, because it's like an ideology and we all grow up within ideologies. So it's this scheme that I'm trying to break apart in my work and come up with a different scheme of limits. That's why I say limits without scarcity, limits without thinking that the planet is limited. That's what I mean, limits without scarcity. And this is an image from the magazine of Emma Goldman, she was an anarchist. How many minutes? Okay. An anarchist writing in the beginning of the century. She was a feminist and an anarchist and activist, not activist like we are today, writing tweets, real activist, going to prison and being exiled to Soviet Union and then being kicked by the Soviets out and going back to the US and putting bombs. So like, okay, activist. She was a feminist and anarchist activist. And she was having this magazine called Mother Earth, and interestingly, how do you call them? The aesthetics here, no? The aesthetics here, instead of this bounded earth, you know, that it's not enough, you know, it's only small ball, you know, like we just have this small ball, this stingy nature, you know, we don't have enough of it. We need more all the time. It's the opposite. You see two naked people and an abundant earth. She called her magazine a magazine celebrating spring day where earth is at its more abundant. So here we have the opposite idea. We have the idea that earth is abundant, and in order to celebrate and protect this abundance, we have to live a simple life. It's a simple life here. It's without clothes, it's without anything. And it's actually a life full of pleasures, because there is obviously the implicit reference to free sex here, free love, which was the main argument of Emma Goldman at her time. So Emma Goldman was an advocate of population control, of birth control. So she was about the right of women to limit how many children they have. So it was about what I call self-limitation. But she was saying this as a collective project, a political project that she was organizing for. And interestingly, she wasn't saying that women should limit how many children they have because the planet is limited and we're going to run out of resources or whatever, you know. She was saying women should limit how many children they have first in order to be able to enjoy sex, which at the time wasn't really allowed to women. They were allowed to have sex only with her husband in order to procreate. So she said once they can limit how many children they're going to have, they're going to enjoy also sex, because they're not going to have a child every time they have sex, obviously, no? The second reason she said why they should was for birth control was because she said we shouldn't be producing as women meat for the imperial war machines, like soldiers, which was what the nations were asking of people: procreate, procreate, because we need to be bigger. We are France, we need to be bigger than Germany. Germany, we need to be bigger than France to have more soldiers. And the third, which was the most interesting argument, they said also we don't want to produce surplus labor for the capitalist factories to have cheap workers and pay us nothing. So her argument about self-limitation was an argument that had a political dimension and the direction of changing the system. So this is my main argument in the book. I did the mistake the other day to go to Google Reads and see what people write about my book, you know. And, you know, because there it's not the people who write only nice things as a book review, you know, because if you write the book review, probably you're willing to read the book, you're willing to say something nice. But there it's like whoever happened to buy it, so they can say whatever. So someone was saying, hey, so what? What's the new thing about that, you know? What's the new thing about distinguishing between self-limitation and external limits? We need both, he was writing, you know, like, what are you telling? We need both an ethical call for limiting ourselves and and we need to invoke external limits, especially to more conservative people that won't buy the ethical argument. And if you tell them, like, you can't do it anyways, then they will buy it. Well, my argument is no. If you tell people they can't do it, they will want to do it, you know. So if you tell people that there are limits to growth and they can't have growth, conservatives or not conservatives, they're going to do it. And we've all been children and we know that, you know. When the parents tell you you can't do that, that's the desire to do it. Only when it becomes your desire not to do it, and to do other things, of course, not to do anything, only then it starts having a meaning. And my point for environmentalism is that the emphasis should be on what we want to do and what we don't want to do, rather what we can't do. And I don't think the argument that you can't do that is going to go anywhere. Even climate change, we see it. It's not going anywhere. You can't do that. We have emissions. Elon Musk, you know, carbon capture, like investing on new fantastic technologies. We will try to do it. We, not me, but society, capitalist society will try to do it because that's how it functions. So my argument here is for an environmentalism that puts self-limitation, collective self-limitation first. Why do collective self-limitation is necessary? It's necessary because, as I said, is the condition for freedom, but it's necessary also because the way we are heading right now, we are heading to a planetary breakdown and unprecedented disaster in terms of climate change and in terms of biodiversity. I don't put that in terms of limits. I'm not saying we're crossing a particular limit of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. But what I'm saying is that one way or the other, we are destroying the abundance of the planet that we have inherited, and that this has to stop. Why are we destroying this abundance? We are destroying it simply because the system, the economic system we've built, the capitalist economic system, is predicated upon a crazy idea. So I'm not being very reserved in terms of the word I use here. So it is a mad idea. It's madness. So this idea of compound growth, it's simply a mad idea. So it's not that the planet is infinite. It's not if can we decouple or should we decouple, like it's green growth. No, it's just pure madness. If you look at this curve that I have here, this is just plotting global GDP at 3% growth per year. And the small value you see down there is 2018. The large value, the end of the graph you see, it's just 2100. It's not that far also into the future. It's the end of the century. And this is like what the capitalist economy or everyone around expects the economy to be like by the end of this century in terms of GDP. David Harvey, that some of you might know, one of the most famous Marxist theorists and geographers, the most prominent geographer, has said that this is the madness of economic reason. That's where I take it from. This idea that the economy, production, and consumption has to grow at the rate that capital is expected to take returns back, 3% per year minimum, if not 5% that many capitalists expect to make every year. It's madness, and he said it's the most lethal of the lethal contradictions of capitalism. So capitalism has many contradictions, but that's like the worst of the worst. And it is the worst of the worst for many reasons. Like you can imagine like 10 times more energy use, 10 times more resource use. But you can imagine also the problems that capital itself will face, like 10 times more demand will have to be created and people consuming in order to absorb this surplus of 10 times bigger going around, 10 times more money going around and looking for profitable investments. I'm not saying that this has a limit. I'm just saying that it's a crazy thing, and it's not gonna end nice. And the idea is how do you limit this thing? How do you control this? I don't know what happened to me today, and I'm using very big words. Every day is different. I'm saying, how do you control this virus? Because it looks like the curve of the virus right now, which is also exponential. So it is about controlling this thing. It's about limiting it. So how do you do that? And that's what we deal with in our most recent book with Susan Paulson, Giacomo D'Alisa, Federico De Maria, The Case for the Growth. And it's how do you do it? And that's a $1 million question, but we're not using money. So it's the million hugs question. How do we do the growth? How do we grow the current capitalist economy? So what we try to do is not just sketch that from above, but like start from the roots. And we root very much our vision of how do you do that from the idea of the commons and the actual cooperative economies that exist right now. And they're flourishing on the interstices, but also some of them on the center of capitalist economies. That's a photo from a cooperative here in Catalonia, Som Energia, that produces 100% renewable energy and distributes it to its members. I am a member of this cooperative and I receive my electricity from there. They do it at not only it's 100% clean, but it's also at competitive cost to the other multinationals, and also with a democratic governance system. We start from examples like that to think about the growth. We start from cooperatives, we start from the cooperative economy, and we start also by claiming that against all prevalent senses, there are many people, even in unlikely quarters, that do think differently and do have different desires. So not everyone has a desire for more and more, although all of us are expected within the society we live and within the conditions that we face to pursue more and more. And I'm not talking about more and more money. We academics, we want more and more publications in our CV, more and more impact factors. So it's a logic of the system that has permeated every little corner of it. We're not putting ourselves out of that. So we are recognizing that we are part of that because we are part of capitalist economies. We don't live in some fantastical utopian world outside of it. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there are people who believe, embody, and have also different desires, and desires that they are of a more frugal, simpler, modest life, if that were to be possible. And we have different examples from Pope Francis, who is with someone who preached that also with encyclicals and everything, but also going down to everyday people, no, to everyday pensioners that take the simple life or work for their community or work to restore rivers, which is a study we had done and had linked out to degrowth, etc. So we try to say that there are common senses and there are like personal dispositions for something different. There are cooperatives, there are commons that they are emerging, and then the question is what's the articulation with the political? We spend time in the book proposing specific policies that can make a leverage and can push us in a degrowth direction. One of them is a care income, which is a basic income, but with the intention of paying the unpaid work of care workers, women mostly, but also men or all people who are in the house taking care of their kids, their elders or their youngers, and especially under the conditions of the current lockdowns and COVID crisis. We have seen how important is this care work and what a huge subsidy to the current system it is, all this free unpaid work we do. And one of the core policies we propose is a care income for everyone, a universal care income. Another proposal we have is to reduce working hours. I have written a long time ago about that. It's a 4-day working week, Fridays off, I called it. Someone told me, why not Mondays off? I said, Mondays have something miserable about them, better Fridays off. No? But someone said, yeah, Monday, you can sleep 1 day more. 1 day off. We can argue when we take power whether it's going to be Monday or Friday. We talk about the Green New Deal without growth, so meaning a huge investment program, because it's important also where we put our resources now, taking from certain areas that they go now and investing in them where they are most needed. We talk about a change in the taxation system. We're not saying anything new there. We're talking about a carbon dividend, taxing very highly carbon and then giving it back as a tax break labor. So instead of paying for your work, you pay for the carbon you consume. You're taxed for that, and you give it back to people so that it's not that the poorest people are hit more by carbon tax, which is the main obstacle carbon taxes face right now. We talk about policies to support the commons, which is a central idea. What do I forget? Yeah, I think I covered those 5. Yes, these are the 5 policies we cover in the book. There are many more you can think. So now we have different pieces of the puzzle. We have the personal disposition, we have the communal, the personal, the common, and then we have the policy. So like, how do you articulate these 3 levels? That's the question we put in the book. And we say you articulate them by understanding their articulation rather than saying something trivial like, oh, we have to act on our different levels, you know. And the way we understand the articulation between these 3 levels is the following. We're saying the personal, your personal disposition to use your bike and not your car, your personal disposition to have a job that doesn't pay that much but keeps you fulfilled. That's the personal disposition. In order for it to be expressed, you need to have the structures around you where this can be nourished, the niches, you might call them, or the structures where this is possible. You want to eat a different type. Okay, I'm finishing. You want to eat a different type of food. You want to eat from zero and locally sourced food and from a local cooperative. So you need these structures around you. You need the cooperatives. You need to have the energy cooperative where you take your energy from, what I just described. So you need that. But these forms, to the extent that they are organized as a commons, you're not just a passive consumer, but you're also an active participant and producer in the production of the different that you also live by. So you have the structure. So the personal becomes communal, and the communal creates space for the personal to be expressed. Now, this wouldn't go far if the policies and the state go against it. So if you have like a right-wing government that wants to persecute cooperatives, you're finished, you know. If you have a right-wing government that closes public transport and reduces the price of gasoline, again, like you might want to use bike, but the car will hit you, and you're done. Like, good luck using your bicycles. So you need then the government to create the favorable environment for this to take place. But in order to have the government, you need to have the people who vote for the government, and then the people who vote for the government are the people who become politicized with these commons that we talk about. So being part of these commons and receiving your energy from an energy cooperative, then you're willing to support the political party or the government that it's going to support the cooperatives. So we think that's a coevolutionary process, that it's the only one that we can think now of how something akin to degrowth could be articulated. It's a very difficult one. I mean, we would be foolish to say that this is straightforward, no, and that we found something that no one has thought before. But at least we articulate a path that we think it's the only one through which a political, personal, and communitarian change can take place. We use a lot the example of Barcelona. It's not a perfect example, but it is an example where something similar took place. So we had a political mobilization, which were the occupied squares of 2011. Different movements of the city from the cooperativist movement came together in the squares of the city. They founded the municipal movement party, that many of us of our groups here were involved. And this party became the governing party of Barcelona in very surprising winning elections. And even more surprising, it survived also the latest elections where it was supposed to lose, but it's still a government. Not huge percentage, but enough percentage to govern, around 20%. And this citizen movement at the same time has supported and opened up spaces of cooperation in the city. So this is the model we envisage. Now, we want to criticize it. Yes, there are many things to criticize. It's not watertight, and it's not without its contradictions as anything in this world. We have a joke in the book. I don't remember the number we have, but we say it at a personal level. If up to 4 contradictions, if you have less than 4 contradictions in your life, you are a fanatic, so you're not welcome. If you have more than 10, then you're a hypocrite, somewhere in between is fine. So 4 to 10 contradictions are accepted for a political party or for us at the personal level. That's the argument of the book. I guess, and that's a last slide I have, which is interesting because it's from the last campaign of Barcelona en Comú, the governing authority that I was talking about, and brings many of the things I talked, brings them together. So it's the publicity campaign that I would have run if they had asked me, but they didn't ask me. But it seems that we all share the same ideas here in Barcelona, at least in a particular milieu, because the slogan they have here is there is enough for everyone if we share better. And that's precisely what I was trying to argue in my limits book about Malthus, that Malthus said there is not enough for everyone to have a decent share. And I turned that upside down, and that said there is enough for everyone if only we share, And this is what also the publicity campaign of the political party is here. Interesting also, the party is called Party for the Commons. Here they say sentit común, which means common sense. So they're playing also with the second big idea of our second book, of the case for degrowth, where we say that it's a matter, we use here a Gramscian term, which is a matter of changing the common sense of the population. And the way we articulate this potential change of the common sense of the population is the process I explained, the articulation between the personal, the communal, and the political. And here, thank you is coming. So I finished. Thanks.
Thank you, Giorgos. And I think there will be many questions from our audience. Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I see first person was signed up for questions, so we can start from Giuseppe and then go to Akis. Giuseppe.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk, Mr. Kallis. I have a question. I was interviewing a member of an assistant of the member of the Greens in the European Parliament, and we were actually asking about that. We were talking about, well, they told me that opening up debates as the one in growth in the European Parliament was politically unfeasible to them. That although, and I have seen that there is a growing awareness among civil servants and politicians and political assistants within the Parliament and within the European institutions about the problem that you presented and about the problem that economic growth represents. They see the problem as unfeasible and they don't know how to open it up. In your opinion and in your experience, what are the most relevant barriers for governmental institutions to open up the debate on economic growth?
I'm a little bit surprised to hear that, because I agree that there are barriers, so there's no doubt about that. And the barriers are okay. On the one hand, the interests. On the other hand, it's a dominant ideology. And on the other, on the most important thing is that current capitalist economies need growth in order to be stable. So there isn't a lot of thinking or experimentation with alternatives. So it's not clear what would substitute growth. So it's really difficult to think beyond growth. So I would say growth is both the religion of our times and the material reality of our times, which makes it like it's not just a god that God doesn't exist and you can say like fight for the existence or not, and then maybe win the. It's also that you depend on this god actually giving you the goods, otherwise you're in trouble, you know. So the obstacles are this. I mean, there are systemic obstacles to that. Now, I truly believe in political processes, and that political processes can change debates, can change realities, and can open up possibilities. Now, what possibilities will open, we don't know. But I'm surprised to hear that from the Greens, because Philip Lamberts, who was the head of the Greens, organized 2 years ago, with our participation, a post-growth conference in Brussels, and he did his best to bring in the room ministers, commission officers, and activists and academics. He did it also with the collaboration of the Left Party and who else? I think even the Social Democrats. Some of them were involved in the. So he tried. It wasn't a failure. I mean, okay. I would have liked the commission officers who came there and the ministers to talk more openly about post-growth. Mostly they were avoiding, and they were saying what they do, you know, how politicians are, you know. So they were there, but they were talking about different stuff. But then they were asked questions by the public, and then so there was an opportunity for something. So I would like to hear what this member of the parliament thought went wrong there, or could be improved, rather than hear that it can't happen when it just happened 2 years ago. That the doors opened and very important people participated there. On top of that, I know now of an initiative that it's done by the Zoe Institute in Germany, not in degrowth terms, but post-growth, and actually is working groups of functionaries from all departments of the Commission, working together to discuss post-growth. There was a call in the Parliament the other day, the European Parliament, to legislate and put a direct limit to degrow the material resource footprint. So I think things are moving. We're definitely not where we were like 5 or 6 years ago, that this discussion was impossible.
Thank you, Giorgos. And I wanted to ask you something. I mean, before we go to Akis, in the European Union, I mean, do you think it is possible overcoming the growth idea? In the end, you know, the idea of economic growth is the sort of foundation of the Lisbon Treaty. It is also written in the parameters that run the functioning of the Eurozone. If you think about, you know, the parameters of the Maastricht Treaty, well, deficit to GDP, debts, public debts to GDP, you know, if we advocate for not even for degrowth, but, you know, for overcoming the idea of economic growth per se, dropping it as an objective altogether, well, this is going to create problems to countries which want to follow this path, because they will be subject probably to an infraction procedure, because you are deviating from the European stability mechanism and from the convergence parameters, which are suspended for now, but just suspended. So the question I want to ask to you, and then we will turn to Akis, is post-growth compatible with the European Union ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, it's the European Union. We have to think as a political institution. We have to hope that it's open to change. So if we take the European Union that and the way it treated Greece, etc. I mean, the way at least we've read through the pages of Yanis Varoufakis and what he has shared, etc. This type of European Union obviously is very antithetical. So on the one hand, we can hope that there can be political change. On the other hand, we have to see that the external conditions are changing. So what is happening right now where the economy has really come to a stall, let's see how long it will take place, and let's see what follow after, because right now there's free money flowing, but at some point it will have to be paid, and then if it's to be paid by austerity, it's going to be 5 times worse than last time. So we'll see what comes out of these things. I cannot really predict. The other thing I can point to is that already we have countries in Europe that they might still think about growth and talk about growth, but they are not growing. And again, you're Italians, I think, so you can tell us more about it. We are Greeks and we can tell you even more about it.
Even if you take the EU as an aggregate, I think, and if you look at the GDP historical series, yeah, there has been stagnation over the last 20 years. So I think, this is a very good example of the fact that even if you have a free trade area, which has written in its constitution the idea of economic growth, the idea of keeping prices constant, favoring economic growth, well, these proves difficult to achieve.
Yeah, at some point, this disjuncture might lead to something new. I mean, I'm not saying something very specific now, but I'm teaching now to my students how the idea of growth came up, and you see that it came up in the 1930s. It was the New Deal, it was Roosevelt. Like before, we weren't even measuring GDP. No one was talking about growth of the economy. They were talking about growth of population or trade. So it came in a particular period of time that growth also happened because of the war, and then after the post-war there was the reconstruction. So this is, and then there was the Cold War competition. So all these things made sense. And there was cheap oil, not cheap, cheap-end oil, by controlling the Middle East, etc. So this is how growth came and got entrenched. But at some point, when your goals stop makes sense, then something else might come up, and this is how I can imagine change happening. Rather than very consciously government saying, we don't want to pursue GDP more, etc. But at some point, if there is no possibility to pursue GDP, then there is effort to do something with climate change that might require economic sacrifice in the short term. Like there is economic sacrifice right now to fight the pandemic. No?
Definitely. Thank you, Akis. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Giorgos, for your great presentation. Following Andrea's question, I mean, I really hope we can overcome this growth fetishism and experience a transition to a more convivial society. However, the question that remains is that how we could actually realize this transition. I mean, ideally, of course, this should originate through the cooperative economy, because that would mean that people have reached to the point that can think in terms of solidarity and what is good, not only for them as individualists, but also for society itself. in your opinion, do you think that we are in need of, let's say, more state intervention, like, or we should just leave the markets to its thing, however, running the risk of a great rebound effect that comes from these greenwashing strategies that we see that the corporations are abiding at the moment? Thank you.
Yeah. No, our approach is not ignoring the state or anti-state. So that's why I said we articulate the personal, the communal, the cooperative, and the state. So against others who might say like real estate is completely capitulated to capitalist interests, so you have to forget the state and we have to self-organize outside of the state. We are thinking of the state as being part of what collectively collective power can try to transform. Now, this might sound utopian, but I don't think there is a possibility of doing this change without changing the state from the inside. So, but this again doesn't mean that just a political strategy of electing like a little bit of a more progressive government here and there will do the whole thing. This is why I said it's important to articulate that you need a mobilization that has like a economic basis also, and that this is expressed into a political force. And in turn, this political force gives a positive feedback to those. So the state, I think it's really important. I think it's really important in terms of regulation. I'm not the person who don't care who is elected, to be honest. Even between Biden and Trump, I think it does make a difference. It doesn't make enough difference. That's also true. But it does make a certain opening, Now, what makes a difference is whether you have a population that it's gonna push ex-Biden to do even more progressive things, or a population that it's indifferent and just voted Biden, and then Biden is gonna become like a normal Republican or whatever. So I'm saying it's always like it's a complex process, and I think the role of the state is central. I mean, it's central because it holds a lot of powers and a lot of economic resources, and because it is a strong force that we have right now with which potentially to confront corporate power and fossil fuel interests. I don't see this happening without using the power of the state.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have a question from Abby. Yeah, just a second, Mario. I'm reading a question from the audience. Abby Kadir said New Zealand dropped GDP as a measure of welfare and is focusing on well-being and happiness. Do you consider this as a step in the right direction or transition, Giorgos?
Yeah, I think it's important, but I wouldn't. It's a step in the right direction, but we have to think that this discussion has been around for 20 years at least, so it hasn't moved very much forward. So we need to think also why it hasn't moved forward. Now it's pushed a little bit from unlikely quarters. So now I think the discussion about GDP is pushed by Silicon Valley kind of interest, and the whole idea that the value of internet services or of platforms, etc., is not fully captured by GDP. That's a different thing. Actually, they have more power to change something in GDP in a direction that will start measuring what they do. We have to understand also that the GDP and the indicators are like a political product. So I was reading about the history of GDP in the 1930s. It was a huge political battle. Do you include government expenditures in GDP or you don't? And conservative interests didn't want government to count in. They were saying only private activity is real economic activity. The state is just taxing wealth creators and shouldn't be considered. And there was a big fight there, and the progressives of Roosevelt, etc., they said, no, we don't include government expenditures because they were taking over the economy. So they wanted what they were doing, especially their expenditures for war, to count as part of economic activity. So that was not a predestined outcome. But then there was the debate, okay, what about all the unpaid work, mostly by women at the time and still in the household? Should we account for that? You could account for that, like they accounted for government expenditures by imputing the equivalent private services. You could do the same for household work, but then they decided not to. So all these are decisions that I think they express, the indicators express the political system and what it wants to measure. So yes, I would like to see a political system that wants to measure and prioritize well-being, but it would have to be truly a system that does that rather than depend and follow GDP growth. To finish, I use a nice example, a more visible example in our book, The Case for Degrowth. So we say, like, if you have a car, and you take out the speedometer, but you're still driving the same car, you're screwed 2 times, because you don't even know your speed. So it doesn't help, it doesn't mean you're gonna run slower, or it doesn't mean you're gonna change, you just don't measure your speed and you don't even know, you can crash even worse. You have to change the car. So if you change the car and you move to a bicycle, then the speedometer of the car is no longer necessary.
Okay, no, thank you very much for this answer, Giorgos. And I think we have Mario as well, who wants to ask something.
Yes, Giorgos. Two very quick questions. The first one is related to the post that you wrote about eco-socialism. No, what do you think? What are the major barriers to articulate like an alliance with the traditional left? That, for example, I'm living in Spain, but also in Italy, has been like traditionally hostile to a of the. And the second one is. Because I'm very much interested in the relationship between science, technology, and degrowth. What is the level of technical complexity that we can reach or aspire in a post-growth society? No?
Mm-hmm. Yes, about socialism, that's what we try to articulate in the recent piece. So there are many at the intellectual level, but this intellectual debate, I think it's not just intellectuals wasting their time. No, it represents political debates at a little bit of more abstract level. So there are many intellectuals, socialists or eco-socialists, who are writing around the growth, and there are some who call themselves traditional socialists or modernist socialists. And they're basically saying that in order to confront the climate crisis and the equality crisis, we really have to invest in labor-saving technologies, and we have to invest on technologies that are the ones that capitalism wants to develop, let's say, more or less for the same issues, but that socialists will be capable to develop them because capitalism is bound by existing interests and fossil fuel interests, etc. And the private economy cannot do what it is supposed to do, So there's no, let's say, difference on what is the treatment. It's more the idea that, okay, a socialist government could treat better the current pandemic than a capitalist that cannot intervene and say, we produce so many masks, so many vaccines, etc. So the idea is like, okay, the technologies are what they are. It's like carbon capture and storage, nuclear power, big windmills, etc. And a socialist government would be able to do that because we just nationalize fossil fuel industries, etc. That's one group. The other group, which it's the eco-socialists, but who are also critical of the growth, they say, yes, you're right to criticize capitalist growth and all these things. We want also a transition to something different, but you don't realize that under socialism, we will have a different type of growth. That's not going to be GDP growth. It's going to be well-being growth. It's going to be nice things growing. Cooperatives, etc., and this is going to be growth, socialist growth, and we don't need the growth, no? So to these two arguments we respond. To the first argument, I clearly disagree. I think they get the technologies and the type of transformation they imagine, I think it's wrong ecologically, economically. I don't think it's going to be a solution. It's not feasible, and capitalism is not doing it because it's not feasible. They're not doing it because they don't want to. If they were going to make money and it was better for the economy, they would do it. It's not that socialism is like so much more technologically capable and innovative than capitalism. I think that's not the strong point of socialism. So with the first ones, I disagree completely on that. With the second ones, I see myself in alliance and in close proximity in terms of ideas, but I think they are wrong to try to maintain this discourse and ideology of growth to talk about different things. So yes, this is the distinction. So now with the actual political left, enter also pragmatic forces, and the pragmatic forces is that once a left government comes to power, on the one hand, it has to provide some certain of economic stability, which depends on selling or extracting resources, etc., etc. And on the other hand, the biggest problem of all, which I think touches to what Andrea said, is that there are also the geopolitical issues. So you can't go alone on your own, because then you are forced back to discipline by the threat of arms or by the threat of falling behind. I don't have answers to these things. I understand the pragmatic problems socialist governments or left of center governments who want to do more radical changes face. And I understand their pragmatism, but I want to inject a little bit of at least radical thinking in this pragmatism. And I am going to argue to the extent that someone reduces this thinking even at the level of thinking, cuts the conversation there and saying, no, that's not the way to go. Let's agree that that's the way to go and we can't do it because of real world politics. And I'm fine, rather than say from the beginning you are wrong, So that's a little bit the argumentation I'm involved with. About technology is a big question, and I mean I'm willing to learn more from you there, because I think technology becomes such a misnomer of different things that I think confuses more than clarifies the conversation. So no matter what, right now in a future that we want to reduce carbon emissions, we want to have energy to support a basic level of living, we would have to absorb or take some carbon back from the atmosphere, etc. That cannot be a future where we give up on the artifacts we have developed until now. But the question is like, what artifacts, for what purpose, etc. I think the growth, to one hand, it is a critique of certain technologies, specific technologies like nuclear power. We think nuclear power is problematic for many reasons, because it solves one problem and then it creates another, which is like huge risks of accidents and waste disposal. So but this is not an argument against technology as such. It's an argument on a specific technology. So the growth is against specific technologies, that they are meant also with an imaginary of growth, etc. And it is against a certain ideology of technology, which is, let's do whatever can be done. Like, don't put limits to scientific research. Let discover what can be discovered. And instead, what I argued as self-limitation, I talk about ancient Greece there. So in ancient Greece, there was a very strong notion of hubris and of prudence, that it didn't mean you wouldn't do things. Like Icarus, the myth of Icarus, no? It was the myth of technological hubris. He flew and he went too close to the sun and he fell down, right? His wings melted. The point is not that you shouldn't have wings to fly, but it's like you should always have a notion also that, you're flying too high right now, your wings are going to melt. So it's not, at least that's my interpretation of the growth. It's not an argument against the wings, it's against overusing the wings.
Thank you. Sergio wants to ask a question.
Yes. I don't know if you already replied to this question. We talked about scarcity, and that is important to share in order to solve our problem. In your opinion, in future, we hope soon, will people understand that it's important to share, and how can we do to spread your thoughts that after this presentation is also our thoughts?
Yeah, my argument is only first of all, by instituting slowly these structures of sharing. So that's where I said the personal meets the communal, So if you participate in structures of sharing, like sharing, the value of sharing becomes common sense. If you live in a setup where you share, or if in your university you share tasks rather than each one going to their own office and doing their own things as we do right now, sharing becomes a common sense. So that's why we say articulating the personal with the communal and the organizational. It is about sharing becoming common sense, and this is where this publicity I put of the political party comes into, It's common sense that if those who have too much share, we have enough for everyone. So that's there. Now the question is how this common sense spreads and gets articulated into real possibilities of sharing. And this is where the cooperative economy, I think, is important.
Thanks, Giorgos. I think there is Renato who wanted to ask a question.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Thank you to Giorgos for his very nice presentation. So I have, let's say, two questions. The first one is, if I'm not an expert of the growth course, and so I'm curious to know if, according to you, there is a sort of different recipes, degrowth recipes for global South and North and global North countries. That of course have a different problem of development and growth. Considering, for example, the different the current disaster of the Amazonian forest that is intended from the ruling government as a way to sustain the growth in that country. And the second question is about technology. I'm linking with what Mario said about the role of technology for the growth. I know, I mean, the question is, if you know the concept of frugal innovation, that is based on the concept of doing better with less. Okay, if there is some connection, I mean, if you can imagine some connection between the concept of the growth and the concept of frugal innovation. That is a way to not have a better efficiency, but let's say diverse efficiency. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think there is a link. I mean, I had come across the concept a few years ago, so I didn't follow it, so I don't fully know the literature, but I think frugality is a core keyword in the degrowth vocabulary. Like Serge Latouche, who wrote the first and most famous degrowth books, he was calling degrowth a society of frugal abundance. So this idea of frugality is there, and then the idea that we will have to innovate technologically, but in different ways, is also there. So frugal innovation to me sounds right, but I would like to read a little bit more on the concrete examples to also have a better view of it. About the global South, generally what we write also in this book is that we are speaking for the places we come from. So we talk about the global North and high income countries, and we say for two reasons, because that will be an improvement in this world if people start talking about the places they are from rather than others, without this meaning that we should leave others alone. No, we should join them in their struggles and in their fights, but we should listen rather than talk and preach. So we're saying, like, about the growth, we're not like Jeffrey Sachs, like we're not gonna fly with planes and go to the Brazilian government and tell them how to do the growth. That's not the idea. So the idea is you listen to Brazilians, you go there, you listen to what's happening, and you say, like, okay, this is how we understand the growth in Spain. What are the struggles, the arguments you're using here, and how the two are connected. And obviously there is the thing that in many areas and regions of the global South, and not only the global South, there is a need for a certain type of material development, resource development, more energy use. We like to think of that in terms of post-development or different modes of human development that do not reproduce the standard capitalist growth model. But the good news, I think the thing I feel good is that the growth doesn't sound that strange to when we talk with people from disenfranchised communities in the global south. My co-author Giacomo D'Alisa went and presented our work to indigenous communities in the Amazon, actually, and he said like he felt much more at ease there than he felt in Sao Paulo with academics, that they were much more critical of him, you know. But he was saying they lived much better lives than us, but they were critical of the growth, you know. But with the indigenous tribes, he had much more accord, and they said like, okay, what you're saying, we're saying it in different terms, but we also want to escape this one-way future of capitalist development that it's destroying our communities. The same when we presented our recent book now in the University of Florida. There were participants there from Native Americans from the US, and for them it was like what we were talking about fully made sense. So it wasn't them that said like, oh, we need economic growth, etc. No, so there is a resonance, but this doesn't mean that what we are talking about and these ideas are directly transferable to other contexts. So I wouldn't say that Brazil or a country in Africa has to implement our 5 policies for nothing. But I'm interested to hear from people from this context, like what makes sense in our work and what type, if you want, policies or actions or changes would make sense in a way that it's in dialogue with the growth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George.
Olga, you want to ask a question yourself and also maybe quote what you wrote about the Swedish concept of lagom. Please go ahead.
The barking dog, and she's about to embark on barking. That's why I've sent the question written.
It doesn't
Anyway,
matter, don't worry.
I'm catching on. Loli, get down. No, thanks a lot. It's really a nice concept. I've got nothing to do with. I just saw the link Andreas put, and I thought it would be really interesting to see. And I'm completely with you on the whole idea of the growth. But what I've noticed is it kind of requires a whole new ideology. You mentioned Emma Goldman. They've decided sort of to kill the few political leaders that tend to work in 1920s, minus the 22 years in prison. I don't think it would work as well now. So it's changing, isn't it? And if you read Freire, you can understand we're kind of all oppressed. So we sit here in our ivory towers talking about changing the world, but then equally we're oppressed by this desire of own, by this comfort, you know, we're in ideological slumber. I just thought you've probably been involved in a few things, like what's the new activism in your mind looks like, because it's the change of ideology, and is it actually realistic and possible, or do we just going to drift into this never-ending discussion, and there's going to be that until the capitalism sort of wills itself out somehow again? Sorry, that's a long question, but I've written it for you there in a shorter form.
No, Emma Goldman is not the example for. No, I don't know if she's the example, but I don't think she. I don't know. No, you might argue whether she changed things or not in the US at her time. Definitely, the women's movement gained many victories, and it's also thanks to people like her, you know. But there were also different tactics and different strategies. The strategy we articulate now is the one I said, but I realize that I acknowledge that it might feel too little, you know, too little, too slow. So yes, the strategy we articulate is the one of having the conversations, having the stories. It's one of us personally assimilating this way of thinking, organizing collectively at the level of the commons, and then this level of the commons becoming a political movement that takes expression at the highest state level and then positively feeds back. Now, hold this as an ideal if this could take place, because you ask me what I would like, then contrast that to reality. Could that take place? it seems very difficult to take place, and to take place at the level, speed, and different changes that comes. But then comes the factor, of historical indeterminacy and contingency, you know, because yeah, if you were in the Eastern Bloc in 1987, no, or 5, I was 13, 15 years old now. I wasn't in the Eastern Bloc, I was in Greece, but I was very much following the politics now. Like, no one would think that 5 years after suddenly dramatic changes would take place. Of course, it changes direction of capitalism, of the powerful system, etc. So it's perhaps it wasn't that surprising in that, but still, it was a system that seemed quite strong at the time, and it proved much more fragile. I think we might be in a similar moment. So what will come after might come something worse, for sure. But I don't think we can rule out changes, and I think changes in a positive direction will happen only if there are people thinking in these positive directions, and also if there are structures cultivating these positive directions. One thing is for sure, that if we don't think about this and we think it's impossible, it won't happen even if the system collapses like Soviet Union collapsed, you know. So it will become something worse, which is also, it's always the most likely outcome, let's say. But we have also to hope and organize and theorize an alternative outcome.
Thanks, Giorgos. A final question, probably from myself, unless there is somebody else who wants to ask something. I mean, you have touched upon these already when you were talking about the Silicon Valley, but do you see a risk of sort of cultural appropriation of the limits idea of the degrowth paradigm from capitalism itself? You know, they might say, well, we need to do this, but we will manage this process ourselves. And this, of course, could have bad consequences for what I still like to call the working class. And what is the process that we need to follow to make sure that these ideas are revolutionary ideas which can be useful for the majority of the people?
Yeah. No, there is definitely the risk. No, there is the risk of a moralizing, of wealthy people saying, like, you know, it's difficult times, you should all, and this takes place. And some people have argued that there is, I mean, I haven't followed German politics that much, but that in Germany, within conservative circles, there was an austerity discourse that was along these lines, no? And celebrating also the ability of Germans to be disciplined and limit themselves compared to the profligate, lazy Mediterraneans, etc. No, I think all ideas can take different dimensions. I think to be radical, it has to be positioned within a context of ideas that it's radical. That's why, for example, in my book, I draw this distinction between Malthus and Emma Goldman. No? So one is the example of how this discourse of limits precisely is used there to conservative purposes, and you can see the articulation of the ideas that they're more or less the same till our day. You know, they're not that different. And then Emma Goldman, for me, symbolizes not the tactics that Olga mentioned, but symbolizes, at least as an articulation of how she articulated. She wasn't a theorist, so it's me reading her, right? She never said that I'm talking about limits. She even called herself Malthusian, which I think was stupid. And I was always wondering, why would she call herself Malthusian? And then I looked a little bit, haven't done a lot of research, but I looked a little bit, and she hadn't read Malthus, I think, because she was saying like things that were outlandish. She was saying, oh, if Malthus lived today, he would be a supporter of the women's movement and of birth control, and he was very progressive. I say, what are you talking about? You know, the guy Malthus wrote against birth control. Imagine, among all things, he was like against birth control, because he said, like, let working people populate so that we have growth, and let them populate so that they starve and then they work hard, don't try to have birth control. Anyways, but I put these two characters precisely to make this distinction you are saying. So Emma Goldman, the articulation is a radical one. So it's a collective project, it's a movement project, and it's one of limiting one part of what we are doing in order to liberate other parts of what we are doing, and we are doing it with a political outlook, which is an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist outlook. So these bases, I think, are the basis for a progressive take on limits, and Malthus articulates the conservative take on limits.
Thank you very much for setting the boundaries so clearly. So I think it's time to go now, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
This insightful seminar. I think we have had a very good audience. I would like to recommend to everybody Giorgos' book, very short, simple, provocative, and written without any type of academic jargon. So it can really be a very good reading for the people who said even earlier in the Q&A section, how can we learn more about what you talked about tonight? And I don't know, Mario, if you want to have some final remarks. Otherwise, goodbye.
I just want to say, Aristo, thank you very much. And we keep in touch because we have a lot of research in common, and then we will meet definitely together in the future.
Thank you all very much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Goodbye to everybody.